right, guys, so today's agenda, if you want to take a look, I'm going to share my screen. All right, so this was last week, so let me cross through that. We got all that done. And so this week we're working on sample arguments, and we're going to take some notes on arguments, and then we're going to work on sentence structure. And so that is our goal for the week as we work through prompt 4. So let's head to prompt 4 and make sure everybody's comfortable with that. We got some great questions last class. So the purpose, remember, of step 1 is to understand the prompt. And so you guys had some great questions about the prompt. And so I'll have some feedback for you on step 1, but I want to make sure to go over this again. Okay. So last week we read why we should give free money to everyone. And then we considered Bregman's idea about income inequality. And so Bregman had a lot of solutions based on this social experiment in terms of how to combat income inequality. And so what we're going to do is you're going to choose a specific country to look at. Okay. Any country you want. You can look at China, India, Australia, just a country you're interested in studying, Japan, whatever country you want. Okay. And so we're going to look at income inequality in that country and how the media portrays income inequality. And then we're going to look at how the American news agencies portray that income inequality for that country. And then we're going to compare it to how the own country's media portrays and covers income inequality. So I'll give you a great example. Notice, though, that we're not debating how to solve income inequality. Notice the focus of the essay is how the news covers it. Okay. Now, here's the complexities behind it. And I think we've talked about this before. There's a lot of complexity behind our current media, and we're going to go over some of that today as well. And so the media has become very multi-layered, and there have been, and there are now dozens of ways that the media has to continue to check its own ethics to be sure that journalists and media companies are portraying news accurately and fairly. Okay, so one of the probably biggest examples that I can think of is the country of India. If you guys, and hopefully you do know from Western Civ, know anything about India, they traditionally have a caste system. And a caste system is kind of like a class system. So pretty much if your parents are poor and you are born to your parents, obviously, you are poor, and that's just who you are. You are born into it. There's nothing you can do to pull yourself out of poverty. So that caste system is what continues to oppress people and lock people into a certain income. So if you were going to study India, that is something that you would want to know. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So this paper, and this is why the paper is 4 pages, because there are lots of considerations that we need to make when we're analyzing income inequality, because income inequality, and we used to call it poverty, but we figured out that poverty is just one piece of income inequality. The income inequality is very, very complex. So for instance, a lot of our elderly live in poverty because the government only gives cost of living, which is called COL. Cost of living increases every year. And it's based upon an average. And so if you guys know, because you spend money, right? If you guys know anything about shopping habits, right? You witness how prices of things increase. And if you also think about the elderly population who are on medicines, certain medicines who require more care, that's a population that probably needs more than just a cost of living increase, which is usually around 2%. And so pretty much, once you retire and you're on Social Security, imagine retiring at 67 and then you live 20 years, right? So in that 20 years, your Social Security is going to increase minimally. Okay, so we're realizing that that's just one piece so we're realizing that poverty was bigger than just poor people. It's purposeful income inequality. It's decisions that companies make. It's decisions that governments make. It's decisions that the media makes in order to portray people and companies a certain way. So really what we're looking at is we're looking at the governments, we're looking at media, so that we can understand how ideas are shaped about income inequality. I read this crazy thing over the weekend. I think it was a quote by Einstein, maybe Thomas Paine, I don't remember, Thomas Edison. But it was basically something to the effect of every idea seems crazy at first. And then by the time it's implemented, it becomes normal. So I try to think about that when I think about when I read the news, or when I read a solution that seems crazy. I'm like, well, I'm sure people thought that a computer in every home was crazy at first, and they did. So, context is important. The year that something's talked about, the country in which the issue is talked about, the agency, the media agency that's covering it, all of those influence the way that the topic is covered. And so we're going to talk about that today. So notice again, the focus of the essay is really looking at the way that the media portrays the country and why it portrays poor people in that country the way it does. And next class, we're going to be looking at some photo essays of how poor people are portrayed in the media, which is similar to, there was a study, I think last year or the year before, that talked about those stock photos WITN uses with their stock video when they're covering something. And there was one a few years ago about overweight people, and how there was a study that found that anytime a news agency was talking about a health issue, they showed people who were overweight, assuming that someone who was overweight was unhealthy, and it didn't matter what the health issue was. Recently, we're seeing this with the COVID-19. There have been several news agencies who, when they show coverage of the coronavirus and there's video in the background, they've been showing people of Asian descent. Always interesting to sort of see how research pans out when it comes to the topic that's being covered. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about how argument works, and then we're going to fold in how we're going to make our argument. And then we're going to look at step 2. And for homework, you're going to start on step 2. We'll be spending about a week at least on step 2. So, all right, so I want to look a little bit at some argument notes, and I will post these as well. Okay. Okay, so I want to give you some samples here. Okay, and we're going to be talking about argument and persuasion. The focus of the essay is arguments. Okay, and then we are going to use persuasion in our final essay, but I'm going to go ahead and go over both now because they kind of work together. Okay, and here are just some samples, okay, that I want to talk through. So the first one is companies should not be allowed to read their employees' email. And then the second one is companies should be allowed to read their employees' email. So notice there are two sides, right? There's no fence riding. There's either they should be or they shouldn't be. And you would give proof and evidence of why or why not. And then notice the next set. Single people should not be allowed to adopt children, and then single people should be allowed to adopt children. So notice no fence riding. So we're going to talk through those examples as we talk through the notes. So our two topics are company control over employee email, and then single people and adoption. So we're going to talk about those as we go. All right, so persuasion is typically often stated in the form of an opinion with evidence for or against taking action, and is rooted in emotion, typically. Okay. All right, and typically the goal of persuasion is to bring a person over to your perspective or point of view. Okay, so for instance, why citizens should vote for a certain candidate. So we recently just had a primary, right? And so, you know, maybe you and your family had opposing views on a candidate. I think in both parties there were several candidates that were running to be the candidate, right? Okay, and it probably got to the point where it was heated or emotional, right? Because there's a lot at stake. So why citizens should vote for a certain candidate. Protest against the raising of your rent. So your landlord comes by and says, hey, we're raising your rent $200, right? And you protest that, right? And you know, obviously it's a very emotional issue for you because that's your livelihood. That's where you live, where your family is, okay? A lawyer's deposition for the innocence of his or her client. So a lawyer at the end of the trial, the goal is to wrap up the arguments and then persuade the jury to find your client innocent. So we can see how emotion would help with that. A scientist's research proposal citing the value of his findings. So the scientist is going to use logos the entire research during the entire research project. However, in the beginning, what a scientist will do is try to find funding for the research. And so that's where the scientist has to be persuasive. So they have a proposal, a research plan that they want to execute. And so part of that is persuading people how this research might be valuable to the public. And a lot of that is persuasion because that it might save lives, it might save money, it might add value to personal value to our lives, those sorts of things. And then the last one, Jehovah's Witness, who tells you the benefits of their beliefs, and that could be in a religion, someone who's Catholic or Jewish, who wants to tell you the value of their beliefs, and it's because they're trying to persuade you to feel a certain way about their beliefs, whether it's acceptance or kindness or compassion, just sharing those ideas. All right, so there are some examples of persuasion. Okay, so persuasion, influencing with emotions. Argument is to win the reader's agreement through asserting a claim using reasoning. So the argument relies upon logos and ethos. Persuasion relies upon ethos and pathos. Okay, and both of them are typically used in an effective essay. So you'll definitely use both. Okay, so notice persuasion, also the purpose is to influence the reader, whereas the argument is to win the reader's agreement. You want the reader to agree with you and say, hey, yeah, those are great points. I agree. Okay. Okay, so we've talked about ethos, pathos, and logos. So here's a good review. Okay, logos is rational appeal to rely on sound reasoning, which is logic, logos, right? Okay, ethos is the ethical appeal to show that you have only goodwill in mind, you have good sense, good moral character. A lot of this has to do with tone and the use of evidence and resources that you use, your sources, and we'll look at those in the news stories. And then pathos is emotional appeal, acknowledge sympathies and beliefs. The thing about pathos is it has to be appropriate for your argument. Shaming readers, especially when you don't provide evidence for the shaming, matters. And that can have the opposite effect, which means they won't endorse your point of view, they will reject it. And so that's another one. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in the political climate too, as well. And then assumptions that you have to make is the connection between the evidence and the claim. Okay, so you need to make sure that your evidence backs up your claim in order for the argument to work and in order for the person to accept what you're arguing. Sometimes these connections are inferred and are not directly stated. You have to know who your audience is. When in doubt, directly state it. Okay, so our thesis for this argument essay is we're using the term central claim. So that is the claim that you're going to be making about the coverage or news about income inequality in your country. All right, we're just going to take a few examples here. Okay, and I picked the drug abuse as the topic because it's a pretty hot topic and it has been for a while, and it permeates lots of different areas of our lives. It permeates the legal system, it permeates the healthcare system. So I wanted to make sure that I picked something that is, and especially in light of the legalization of marijuana and so forth. But I wanted to pick something that kind of touched on a lot of different topics. So, if we want to do an essay on drug abuse, okay, notice our central claim is that it's a personal matter that should not be subject to law. So that is what we're claiming. And that's a popular claim of many nonprofits who think that drug abuse is a health crisis and not a legal matter, okay? So drug abuse is a personal matter that should not be subject to law and should be added as an amendment to the Constitution. And I've seen several nonprofits say that there needs to be clarity in the Constitution about what a crime is versus what a personal crisis is. That a personal crisis should not be illegal if someone is having a personal crisis. And then here's another example. So the war on drugs is not winnable because it cannot eradicate demand or supply to meet it, which is why legalizing drugs makes sense. And this is another argument that you've probably seen as well. So notice the central claim there is that since we can't win the war on drugs, because we have not been able to impact the supply or demand, people still want it, and there are people who will supply it. So it's kind of like that, if we can't beat them, join them sort of mentality. So there have been some arguments about this as well. And I've seen arguments for legalizing all drugs, which is, I think, more a sort of a libertarian political stance. And then I've seen other arguments that would decriminalize it, which is not the same as legalizing it. It would just make it a misdemeanor, I think. So I've seen that too. So there's lots of ways you could go with that one. Now, what's interesting about argument is that the thesis can be found at the end of the essay, so you can build up to the thesis. If you are even remotely interested in doing this, talk to me first, because it has to be done a certain way. It's called a reverse essay. Okay, so when you have your evidence, there are 4 things that you need to think about, in an argument. So you need to make sure your evidence is accurate, that it's taken from a reliable source, someone who has done the research, who has a wealth and variety of experiences. And we're going to talk about all those things as we talk about the media. Representation, that it reflects reality without exaggeration. We see a lot of exaggeration in the media right now, especially in the form of headlines called clickbait, right? And you're going to read a little bit about that as you read about the history of media and some of the lawsuits that happen because the headlines are complete exaggerations. It has to be relevant, reflects current thinking by experts and experts in their fields. So for instance, if it's a healthcare issue, healthcare experts should be sources, right? And then adequacy, it should support the claim in full and it should support the claim in its entirety. So it should be an adequate amount of information because remember, the goal of argument is to get the person to agree with what you're saying. Okay, so the order of your ideas also matter, okay? There's always a gradual, gentle sharing of your position, right, of your claim so that the readers will consider it. So the order of your evidence does matter. And remember, use what you know about your readers to appeal to what matters to them. So this is an issue of audience, okay? One thing that we will do in argument is we will do what's called a counter argument, which means we will legitimize their point of view, and then we will use it to clarify our point of view and to help them come to your side. And guys, when you're forming your own personal views, a lot of the times there is a way to have a view opposing someone else, and still admit, one, that there's gray area, and two, that person's point of view is valid. And listening to someone else's point of view does not negate yours. In fact, it helps you refine your point of view, because the world is not very black and white. There's a lot of gray, and it's a spectrum, right? So maybe you're closer to one idea, and you're farther away from the other idea, but you can accept that the other idea exists, and you can use some of that evidence to continue to refine your own idea. Now, the key to argument is trying to find that, or counter argument is trying to find that common ground by using evidence. And this is, counter argument's also a place where you can kind of try to find some personal experience to share with the audience. And we'll talk about how to work that in if it's appropriate. So for instance, sometimes I have students. So for instance, I had a student do Greece one year, and we did a different topic that year. I think we did human rights. But that student had family in Greece. So he did Greece. And one of the things that it was actually a struggle for him to integrate himself into his essay, because he was too close to the topic. And he was writing the argument like a narrative almost. And so he kind of forgot that he was writing an argument and not a narrative. So that's why you have to be careful about your integrating personal experiences. Okay, so there are two types of reasoning that we use in argument. The first one we just used in the annotated bibliography, and it's called inductive reasoning, a collection of evidence on which to base a generalization or claim of the argument. So remember how we collected all that evidence about the company, and then we made our claim, right? Okay. So reasoning from particular experiences to general truths. So we grabbed many experiences from a variety of perspectives, and then we made a general truth, which was the company does or does not effectively develop technology or use technology to benefit us, right? Okay. This time we're using deductive reasoning. So we're going to move from a general statement to a particular case or situation. So our general statement is how the media covers income inequality. And so we're going to move to a particular case or situation by looking at a country's coverage. Okay. And this is called syllogism. And this is Aristotle. It's basic philosophy and logic. And there's sort of a 3-step form of reasoning. So here's an example. All men are mortal, right? This is a fact or an assumption. Socrates is a man. Okay, this is our evidence. Therefore, Socrates is immortal, and that's our conclusive thesis, and that's our claim. Okay, so a modern example, what would be a good modern example? I can't think of one off the top of my head. Okay, here's a good one. Let's think about it in terms of the COVID-19 and just general coverage, general medical coverage in general. So for instance, so let's say all doctors are all doctors learn medical knowledge, right? We know that's a fact, okay? Dr. Fauci is a doctor, right? That's our evidence. Therefore, Dr. Fauci has extensive medical knowledge, and that's our claim. Okay, does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. And you can do it with with yourself too, right? In anything in your life. So, okay. All right. Sometimes there are logical fallacies, and these are things that we would want to look for in our news stories, and sometimes these are used by people who are not trained in journalistic ethics. Sometimes these are used by companies who have an agenda or who have a bias. Sometimes these are used by organizations that have an agenda. And hopefully you kind of saw a lot of that in the previous essay about the company. In terms of, hopefully you saw some of the bias on your own company page. Hopefully you saw some of that on other pages. Okay, so the first one is called a non sequitur, which means it does not follow. So the conclusion doesn't follow the premise. Okay, if we look back at this, right? So the major premise was first, and then the conclusion was last. So what non sequitur means that the conclusion that you drew is not logical from the fact that you started with. Okay. I would say probably the best one here is some of the fad dieting, because weight loss is complicated, right? It's very complex, and we like to simplify some of the health things. There are so many things that we don't know about our body. So, for instance, I think 2 years ago, scientists discovered a new organ in our body. And figured out what its function was. And so there's so many things that we don't know about the human body, and sometimes that's scary, right? So let's say, you know, our premise started with, you know, something about weight gain or whatever, weight loss. Okay, so let's start with this. So our fact or assumption would be that cabbage makes you lose weight. Okay, so cabbage makes you lose weight. And then your evidence would be, I lost weight when I ate. No. Okay. Okay, let's say this. Cabbage burns fat. So that's our fact or assumption. I ate cabbage for a week. Therefore, I burned fat that week. Okay. So it's way more complicated than that, right? So that's a non sequitur, that it doesn't make sense for it to follow because of the complexities, or because just the linear thinking. Oversimplification needs the explanation for complicated phenomenon. You know, you probably hear a lot of that, you know, and sometimes I use it with my younger kids, you know, as a joke, you know. So you've probably heard some dad jokes where, you know, you'll come up to your dad and you'll be like, oh, my thumb hurts, or it hurts when I do this. And what do they say? They're like, well, don't do that. Right. That's a great example of a joke that's oversimplification. Hasty generalization, leap to generalization from inadequate or faulty evidence, like a stereotype. Hasty generalization is probably the biggest problem with some of our media. Our media will take 2 news stories, and the people will both be wearing Crocs, and they'll say, oh, people who wear Crocs like to rob banks, right? You can't base that on 2 people. And that's what a generalization is. And then either or reasoning, assuming there's only 2 solutions to a problem, right? Okay. That's a great one as well. There's a lot of gray area in the world, right? Unidentified or doubtful authority, that's another big one. So if a news media does not share who their source is, that can be problematic, especially if they don't explain why they can't share it. And then doubtful authority would mean you question this person's expertise. And that's the ethos, is when this person is sharing their ideas, can I trust them? And do they have enough experience to draw that conclusion? Argument ad hominem, attacking the views by attacking someone's character. So for instance, if you don't agree with them, you call them a moron, you call them an idiot. There's a lot of media that does this, and they call themselves news. A genuine journalist will not attack someone's character and call them a moron in a news story. Okay. And there's a difference between calling someone, so for instance, a moron, and calling someone or saying someone has a lack of expertise. Okay. One you can prove, the other one you can't. Begging the question, taking for granted from the start what you set out to demonstrate. So that means that you really didn't believe what was said in the first place. Or you assume you're already correct, and that's begging the question. And then post hoc after this, because of this, assume the order is the cause. So for instance, if I'm, outside and I sneeze, and then after I sneeze, I turn around and there's a $10 bill behind me. Does that mean that my sneeze caused the $10 bill to appear? No, the two things just happen to fall in that order. And then what's called a false analogy, claim likeness when no likeness exists. I would say probably the biggest one that's going on right now is comparing. So for instance, comparing what's going on with the detainment of immigrants in the United States to the Holocaust. And a lot of people are claiming that it's false analogy. You've probably seen that a lot in the news. And so that's probably the one that is most recognizable to you. I think another one is where there are some comparisons between like COVID-19 and the regular flu. Really the only likeness is that they're both viruses. So that I've seen at least. So those are things that you would want to look at. And a lot of times people will use false analogy in order to serve a purpose, which is to minimize or maximize coverage or attention to something. Okay, we just did that one. Okay, so the process, finding a subject. So today we're going to talk about how to find your subject and how to sort of develop your own opinion on it and get some expertise on your own. Okay. In terms of organization, we're going to have our introduction. Okay. In terms of how we present our evidence, we're going to start with the least important point and then strengthen as we go. So once you have your evidence for your assessment of the coverage, whether it's good or bad, if it's bad, you're going to start with your weakest point and you're going to move to your strongest point that proves how bad the coverage is. And then we're going to have a paragraph that's called counter argument that is the response to the objections. We're going to predict the issues that people might have with our argument, and then we're going to address them directly. And we're going to use reason. Okay. And then conclusion, we'll gather our points, restate our thesis, and attempt to involve our readers. Okay, so here's a good introduction paragraph to an argument essay. Okay, so we're going to start broad, which is what is the phenomenon we're looking at or the problem we're looking at. Soccer is the world's most popular team sport, and soccer programs have become popular in the United States in the last 2 decades. Unfortunately, the young people in the Upland School District have no official soccer fields. Advocates may wonder if the Upland community should be concerned about this. The simple answer is yes. Upland should build quality soccer fields to benefit all of the students in the school district. So notice we talked about the problem that we're looking at, right? Okay, in those 3 sentences. And then we narrow down to why it is an issue, right? Why should we be concerned? And then we narrow down to our thesis, which is Upland should build quality soccer fields to benefit all the students in the school district. Okay, so it's a quick sample. Okay, a lot of information about argument. Okay, so we're going to move on to taking a look at step 2. We're going to talk about how you're going to build step 2. So if you will move on to your assignment guide. Okay, so we're going to go through step 2 of the assignment guide. And so we're going to talk about all of the tools that you need in order to complete that step. Okay. So analyze the content of one news article from your chosen news outlet to learn more about income inequality. Be as specific as possible with your answers, referring back to the news article in your answers when appropriate. You will want to do this for one news article from your own country and another country. These questions can serve as paragraph topics for your compare and contrast portion of your analysis. Okay. So notice the first thing that we're looking at is the headline. Okay. Right, and notice one of the notes I put up there, which is clickbait. Okay, so clickbait is basically a headline that attempts to simply get you to click. Why? Because that's how media outlets make money. And we're going to talk about sort of the history of that in a few minutes. Okay, so the headline is important. The headline helps you figure out what the purpose of the article is. Is the purpose to give us information, persuade or argue a point, or is it just to get us to click? Okay, is it manipulating us? Okay, discuss the effectiveness of the headline in summarizing the article and getting the reader's attention. Okay, so it should do both. It should summarize the article and grab your attention and make you want to read it. Okay, it should not clickbait you into this flurry of emotions. Okay, it should also not clickbait you into being completely nosy. Think about like a gossip magazine, right? That's very inflammatory. That would be clickbait. Okay. Briefly describe the factual content of the article related to the lead. Okay, and that should say L-E-D-E. So a news lead is different. So anyway, so the lead would be sort of the first little part of the article that kind of sucks you in. Okay. I've got a comment over here. Okay, so briefly describe the factual content. So for instance, who's involved, what's happening, when does it happen, where is it happening, why does it happen or keep happening, and how do we fix it? So the 5 W's and the H. So for instance, one of the things you can think about is what groups are not represented when you look at who is involved. And you could, what I would recommend is read the article first just to get an idea of what's in the article, and then go back and look at the who's. So what names are being used, right? And who are the people? Do we know their title? Do we know their expertise? Is there anyone that was not contacted about, whatever happened? Sometimes in news articles, you will see so-and-so was contacted, but was unavailable for comment. Okay. That is journalistic integrity. Okay. Hiding the fact that that person even exists is not journalistic integrity. Okay. So that's an example of sort of what you would look for when you were analyzing. Okay. How did the end of the article summarize the main ideas and provide connections for the reader? So for instance, am I left wondering about something? Did it wrap it up? Do they glaze over the topic? Is there something I expected to read about and I didn't get it by the end? That's what you got to think about. Okay, facts in news articles are supposed to be arranged typically from most to least important. If the writer used least to most important, why was it effective? So did the order make sense to you? Or was there information at the end that you kind of needed at the beginning? Okay, because remember, a journalist is trying to synthesize important ideas, and they're trying to do it because they've only got you for 5 minutes. So they're trying to boil it down so that you get the essentials. And so if you're reading and in the third paragraph, you're like, what? And you're left wondering. And then you get down to the 8th paragraph and you're like, oh, there it is. Well, you're going to go back up and read the original because you were expecting it to be there, and you got to connect them together. And that's why organization is so important, because a well-organized essay means that people save time and they don't get confused. Okay. Writing style is important in keeping those reading and listening to the article engaged. Comment on the use of the following throughout the article. Active voice. Okay. Active voice is like I, me, mine. Okay. Precise and concise wording. Was there a place where they just took too long to explain it and it could have been shorter? Interesting and varied word choices. Okay. Do they use good word choices that are very meaningful? And then unbiased reporting. Was there any issue with bias that they have to acknowledge? Okay. Discuss the accuracy of the facts. How do you know the sources used were reliable and accurate? What questions do you have that the article does not provide? So for instance, what experts are they talking to? Do you know what kind of expertise they have? Can you find them online? Can you find information about them? Is there any controversy with the experts that they talked about? Or organizations? What are the goals of the organizations that might be referenced? And then if there are quotes, do the quotes add value to the topic? Oh, sorry, that's number 8. In what way did the use of quotations add credibility? So do the quotes make sense? Are they powerful? Do they add to your knowledge? Do they make it more interesting? Do they provide different points of view? The different points of view is very important in good journalistic writing. Okay. Link to other articles, because a lot of times when you go to the news website and you read one article, it'll give you more at the bottom or on the side. So provide the links for those in case you want to find them later. Okay. And so here's a sample thesis statement. Okay, so once we do this news story analysis like 2 or 3 times, then you'll have an idea about your thesis. And so here's a sample. North Korea news fails to acknowledge the damage caused by pollution. However, HuffPost holds each company accountable for pollution across the globe, making the United States a consistent leader in free press coverage for the world. So this is just one sample. And I did it on environment like 2 years ago. So that was our topic. We talked about the environment. So that's why this one's about the environment. So, okay. So there's what you're going to be working on for step 2 for homework. And so I want to go over some information that you'll want to use as you develop your idea. So the first one, and it's on Moodle, is called Popular News Sources and Ideological Placement. Okay. And then, and then the second one is Overview of Free Press. Okay. And the order that you'll want to read them is you'll want to look at the information about the media in the United States. And then obviously you'll need to know about free press in the country that you're looking at. But this will give you a solid understanding of the media in general. And so obviously the first thing that they talk about is the First Amendment, which guarantees a free press, right? And so you can kind of scan through it first to get a sense of what this is about. Okay. And so the first topic that is covered is slander and libel. So slander is to speak false information with an intent to harm. And then libel is to print false information with an intent to harm. So slander is speaking, libel is media, print. Okay. One of the most famous ones was a headline by a gossip column that says, "Addiction nightmare, Katie drug shocker." And she sued them and won like $50 million because she was not on drugs. They were talking about an addiction to Scientology. But obviously that headline was clickbait. It was meant to get people to click so that the company, the news media, could make money instead of provide truth. The next one is classified material. So how journalists have access to classified material. Pentagon Papers was one of the big ones. I think there was just a movie out about that. And there was an example about the Fox News reporter Geraldo Rivera, and I actually remembered this. He went to and followed the military during Desert Storm, but when it was evident that he was endangering the soldiers because the Taliban or Al Qaeda could be watching, they eliminated him. So there are limits to free press, right? When it becomes a safety issue. And then there are lots of media and FCC regulations as well in terms of what you can and cannot do and say. One is the equal time rule, and that has to do with candidates running for office. They must be given equal opportunities for airtime and advertisements. And so there are regulations for that. So that's one of the big ones. There's the indecency regulations, which limit indecent material and keep the public airways free of obscene material. And so obviously that definition of obscene has evolved over the years, and it's between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. is when that regulation is in effect. So late night, it doesn't affect that. George Carlin's one of the big ones that has been censored. There was a big fine in 2004 with the Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction. Super Bowl is one that people complain about a lot. The Telecommunications Act of 1996, it dropped the limit on the number of radio stations, 40, and television stations, 12, a single company could own. So there used to be limits on how many media companies or how many media stations a company could own. That got dropped in 1996. Think about how that impacts the news. If one person owns 200 news stations, they can pretty much manipulate the news, right? Okay. There's a Freedom of Information Act, which was passed in 1966, that talks about how journalists and even us, I mean, we can we as citizens can make a Freedom of Information Act request, and they have to abide by it and give it to you in a certain number of days. So that's another big one. And then there's some information about Freedom of Information Act with regards to access to the president and politicians, particularly in times of war. There's another one that happened, and I think this might actually be the movie, which was The Post, which involved Richard Nixon's involvement in a series of illegal activities. The practice of granting anonymity is important, and it's referred to as reporter's privilege. It's kind of like legal counsel privilege, client privilege, doctor, and it's covered by the First Amendment. So if journalists have a source they need to keep confidential, they have the right to do so with their set of ethics. So, and then there's a little summary at the bottom. That's kind of important to understand how the press works and how they report information. So that's the first one I would look at. And then the second one is a research study by the Pew Research Center, which talks about the ideological placement. So we kind of have several things that we're working with here. So the first thing that a journalist has to consider is their country's free press stance. So for instance, China, they do not have a free press, and their press is heavily regulated. The government does regulate the internet, and it will block certain things from its citizens. So that's something that you would want to know if you were going to talk about poverty in China. So free press is important. The second thing is who owns the media company, because and I think we talked about that in this class. So for instance, Jeff Bezos owns, and Jeff Bezos is the head of Amazon if you use Amazon. So Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. So imagine if you're a Washington Post reporter and there is a scandal involving Jeff Bezos, and there was actually a scandal when he was getting a divorce from his wife and he was dating someone else, that apparently some pictures of his private parts came out. And so imagine being a reporter and reporting not just on Amazon's issues. So like one of the big ones to the forefront recently is some Amazon employees protested because they did not have protective equipment for COVID-19. So imagine working at the Washington Post and thinking that you might lose your job because you provide negative coverage of Jeff Bezos, right? So who owns the media company matters. And then thirdly, because we have so many news channels have started to gear their coverage of certain issues to who their viewers are. And so that's what the Pew Research Center looks at. And this is a really interesting chart that you would want to consider if you were looking at a news media, is ideological placement. So for instance, who are the viewers? Because the news media is going to gear their content toward their viewers and the people who are clicking on their site. And so they organize it by liberal versus conservative. And so what you'll want to look for is you'll want to look for things close to the middle. When you get to the extreme left or extreme right, that's where you're going to see things like clickbait. That's where you're going to see things like journalists calling people who are allegedly journalists, writers, say writers, because anybody can be a writer, but a journalist has a set of ethics and a supervising body and whatever. But when you look at the extreme left and the extreme right, you're going to see more inflammatory language. You're going to see cuss words. You're going to see, so for instance, Slate, pretty well known for calling people morons, just going on diatribes. You'll see very similar things on Breitbart. And these are generalizations. So what you need to remember is that certain journalists or certain news stories might be way more inflammatory than others. So really you're looking for stuff in the middle. I would say, and some of the results surprised me. So for instance, Wall Street Journal being pretty much close in the middle. And notice the middle is really the average person here. Okay. And the average person's political views are just a little bit left. So pretty moderate. Okay. So that's more the middle than the zero. So if you look at that, CBS, Google News, Bloomberg, ABC Today, USA Today are all pretty neutral. NBC News, CNN, MSNBC. So, CNN is characterized by some people as being very inflammatory, but it's actually pretty close to the middle. Now, I would agree with these. The Guardian is pretty left. New York Times is pretty left, but I don't think New Yorker is that far left. I do think Slate's pretty left. Usually Atlantic is pretty much over. Anybody who ever sees a news story by the Atlantic, I think they're pretty extreme as well. I've seen a lot of them, the news stories with curse words and calling people idiots and morons, and I can't read that stuff. That's not journalism. That's like I don't know, 14-year-old's diary. I don't know. It's kind of weird. I'm surprised NPR is this far left because NPR actually has a policy for equal coverage. So, and every news story I've ever listened to on NPR that has to do, especially with politics, is usually has a Republican representative and a Democratic representative, and then sometimes they'll have somebody from the Green Party or the Libertarian Party. So I'm very surprised, but I think this is from 2015, so things might have changed a little bit. But notice BuzzFeed was down here, and there are lots of other ones if you scroll down. So, and these are just the big ones. Oh, you got to go. And just keep hitting next. And it'll give you specific information. So perusing that information will help you figure out sort of whether or not your chosen news source is gonna contain a lot of inflammatory information, or whether you should be weary when you read. And that's the issue. In the United States, we don't promote censorship. We say, hey, here are things that you need to do so that you can make an accurate judgment about which parts of this book or this reading make sense and are logical. So that's the next thing. All right, so I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So your goal is to just pick a country and go to the web and type in. So here, let me share my screen real quick again. So let's say I want to do Japan. I'm going to go to Google here and I'm going to type in Japan. And you can use poverty if you want, because income inequality might not work. And you can even use both, income inequality. And I'm going to type in news. And then I'm going to go to the news tab. Okay. All right. So here's one that talks about several different countries. Oh, this is Wall Street Journal. Tokyo Review. So most likely the Tokyo Review is a Japanese news source. So we're going to look at this news source and we're going to do that worksheet. Okay. And then next class, what we'll talk about is finding your source for your American news medium. Okay. So I'm going to stop presenting and then I'm going to stop recording, and then you guys can ask questions.